And it's a great pleasure to see how much the project has proliferated and enriched. I was here for the advisory board meeting 2 years ago, was it? And it was at its inception, and since then, really amazing things have happened, so congratulations to the team. And I must also say that I love gadgets, and the gadget you have provided us in the conference, the water bottle, is a brilliant idea. I really love it. Thank you. Okay, so the ideas I will be presenting here today are derived partly from my recently published book entitled Islam, Migrancy and Hospitality. Although the language and the terminology we use seem to be different, I think we are targeting similar ideas, so I hope you will be able to establish the relevance. In this paper, I am concerned with the principles and practices of exclusion, the presence of strangers and foreigners trigger, and the mechanisms that are reinstated in the face of the alleged loss of sovereignty. What lies at the core of sovereignty, be it in the form of individual ipseity, nation state, or God, is that it always implies an indivisible, unshakable, and unlimited power. This sovereign indivisibility involves withdrawal from otherness. The nature of the transformations in citizenship has led many to point to the ways in which unitary models of citizenship is disaggregated. While it's not untrue that the unitary forms of citizenship has been disaggregated, in an almost paradoxical fashion, Europe has solidified its unitary identity as Europe, making others within its borders more alien than before, depending on their religious, ethnic, and racial affiliation. It is important that we ask whether the transformation in the nature of citizenship in Europe does alter the consolidated formation of Europe as a sovereign entity, and the racial, ethnic, and religious exclusions such sovereign formation has fashioned. While it's true that the sovereignty of the nation states is now being disassembled, novel forms, institutions, and mechanisms of sovereignty are implemented. For this reason, it's important that we not only examine the new forms and practices of citizenship have received, but also the exclusions brought out by the new imaginaries of Europe and Europeanness. The refashioning of European identity, with its emphasis on common cultural values and traditions, has helped to wither away the intra-European borders. However, the processes which brought about the disappearance of internal European borders and the disassembling of national sovereignties at the same time results in the external borders of Europe to be instituted more stringently, which are centered on the changing nature of the terms of the discourses of national identities, citizenship, ethnicity, and religion. Agamben's notion of the camp, with the state of exception becoming its naturalized norm, designates how certain subjects in many parts of Europe are deprived of rights and citizenship, living in a suspended zone of indeterminacy between life and death. Capturing this condition will enable us to identify the new race thinking in the construction of European apartheid that Balibar formulates. The possibility of envisioning a Muslim country, namely Turkey, in the Union, combined with the uncanny presence of millions of Muslim citizens, has been exacerbating the deep-seated Orientalist anxieties about Islam in Europe. Consequently, cultural and political contestations about Muslim citizens and European identity started revolving around issues of Islam, Christianity, and secularism. Islam, associated with the immigrant ways of life, represented as incommensurable with laïcité and as something that is prone to fanaticism, has started setting the terms of the debate in Europe. A more radical understanding of secularity that Derrida suggests with the concept of desacralization of the political can go beyond the opposition of the secular versus religion. A critique of the question of religion from Derrida's perspective implies a radical critique that is free from theological dogma and entails a particular form of laïcité, a critique without the, quote, dogmatism of secularism, a laïque notion of democracy and hospitality, unquote. Thus, Derrida's laïcité is about a radical critique of the theological political in the name or under the aegis of an unconditionality that exceeds or disrupts all sovereignty. This radical secularity is intimately connected to the question of ethics, unconditionality, and involves the opening of presence to the exposure of otherness, which also opens up the sovereignty to the to come of democracy. Since sovereignty is based on omnipotence, self-determination, and unlimited power, any critique of sovereignty would necessarily imply critiquing the theological basis of sovereignty. In an age where the sovereign constitution of the nation-state is destabilized, we need to explore the theoretical and political possibilities of envisioning a democratic Europe. If, as Balibar suggests, apartheid is the other side of European citizenship, then any imagination of a democratic Europe has to be taught alongside with the democratization of borders. This question necessarily comes along with the question of the possibility of envisioning Europe that does not depart from its inheritance, that is, from the ideals and visions of enlightenment, yet one that remains heterogeneous to that particular tradition, history, or language. Such a notion of Europe is one that invites us to imagine a Europe that exceeds any particular European and or Eurocentric visions of Europe. While not departing from its Enlightenment roots and thus including ideals of democracy, freedom of thought, liberty, and so on, this new Europe, or the Europe to come, needs to entail values that are beyond their current understanding, as well as beyond the commonly defined geographical and political boundaries of what is referred today as Europe. Can we think whether this new Europe be rethought and re-envisioned with the notion of the unconditional, and in particular with the concept of the unconditional hospitality, a Europe whose sovereignty is necessarily and inevitably compromised and auto-immunized by the presence of post-colonial Muslim citizens? Recent years have witnessed growing enthusiasm about the concept of hospitality in an attempt to understand the nature of the encounter between immigrants, exiles, foreigners, refugees, and other displaced populations and their hosts in the new sociocultural and political homes they inhabit. The persistent desire to portray these groups as guests entails discussing the meaning of a series of other concepts and issues such as the host, what does to welcome and receive mean, subjectivity, ipseity, the interruption of the self, conditional and unconditional hospitality, hostility, home, ownership, expropriation, and or dispossession. But most important of all, these debates have highlighted the problematic and convoluted nature of the relation between the ethics and politics of hospitality. There are a number of other issues and stakes that are closely connected with the unconditional welcoming or hospitality as ethicity as such. One important issue pertains to home, ownership, and proprietorship, and the other concerns subjectivity, ipseity, and sovereignty. No doubt they are closely interrelated. In Derrida's understanding, absolute or unconditional hospitality can exist only as unconstrained and hence entails a restructuring of the relationship between the host and the master of the house and the guest. Such a restructuring implies a deconstruction of the at-homeness of the sovereignty of the host. This requires that the ownership and control of the house be relinquished and that the home becomes hospitable to its owner as well. This would turn the host, the owner, to a guest received or welcomed in his own home and thus transforming the host into a tenant as well. This would imply that the home is not owned, or rather it's owned in a very particular form in this unconditional condition. Derrida wants to refer to the fact that when there is unconditional hospitable welcoming, then there is no at-homeness from which the subject is able to welcome the other. When the distinction between the host and guest breaks down, the position of master of the house is dismantled. For this reason, absolute hospitality precedes property. Whereas with conditional hospitality, the guest is welcomed, but still the ownership of the home and sovereignty is retained. Opposing to this kind of understanding of hospitality, Derrida warns us against the risk of danger, of a usurpation of a position of power in the conditional welcoming of the other. Given that absolute hospitality implies a radical dispossession of home, it also implies loss of sovereignty. The loss of sovereignty pertains not only to the land that one inhabits, but also concerns the very concept of subjectivity. Thus, unconditional hospitality not only involves the interruption of a full possession of a place called home, but also entails the freedom of the self from auto-affirmation. This means that the welcoming subject can no longer retain its sovereignty. The welcoming that is offered to the guest entails that the self is interrupted as ipseity, authority, mastery, and thus indissoluble sovereignty contradicts with absolute hospitality. In relinquishing sovereignty, the host gives up possession of his subjectivity and is no longer in possession of himself. But this interruption of the subject cannot be brought out by a decree or law, but is produced in the intentional attention to the other. This implies the subordination or subjection of the subjectum, and hence enables the birth of a subject with freedom. Relating the question of hospitality to new forms of citizenship fashioned by the presence of immigrants, asylum seekers, strangers, and other displaced people invite us to bring and translate issues of hospitality to these concerns, not simply turn it into a regulative idea. The language of clash of civilizations and war of cultures, and the violent exclusion this language engenders, partakes in a robust way in the constitution and maintenance of borders, which in turn results in the marking of the Muslim citizen as an internal enemy. The language of culture wars not only institute borders that separate the European citizen from foreigners, but also shape the very meaning who the foreign is. What is now first and foremost foreign to European culture is the non-secular ways of life lived on European soil, exemplified by Muslim way of life or culture. But what are the constituents of the allergy that is experienced vis-à-vis the Muslim citizens in Europe? An allergy that turns them into strangers to a presumably unified European culture and to the enemies of the secular. It is the triangulation between the political, the religious, and the cultural enemy that now secures Islam's status as an internal exteriority. However, the threat posed by the alien or the recognizable yet unrecognizable otherness, I play here, but I skipped that part. It's recognizable and yet unrecognizable. Well, it used to be the Muslim, the Ottoman, really trying to push the European borders. That external enemy has now mutated itself into an internal enemy, but I'm skipping that part here. So that's the meaning of this internal exteriority. However, the threat posed by the alien or the recognizable yet unrecognizable otherness can be viewed not simply as a threat, but a chance for the survival of a non-sovereign identity called Europe. This paradoxical nature of the simultaneity of threat and survival can be explained through what Derrida calls autoimmunity. Autoimmunity begins with the specter's haunting of the self. Our being is ontologically autoimmune, he says. This autoimmune Europeanization is perhaps the source that is now undermining the constitution of a sovereign and self-identical Europe. In fact, the fictive, autonomous, independent, and stable identity of Europe has never been possible, but nevertheless has always been posed, asserted, and staged. Europe is becoming more vulnerable as a sovereign community, for this is a process that entails its opening itself up to the counter-sovereignty of the other, thus compromising Europe, perhaps undoing itself by autoimmunizing its sovereignty as Europe. Hence, autoimmunity becomes a condition of thinking a democratic Europe, because whenever the sovereign tries to make this power an all-expansive and expensive one and extended scope, it inevitably opens itself to counter sovereignties and thus compromises and autoimmunizes itself. I can see 5 minutes. Okay, I should be done. Its every positing of itself implies its own renunciation and undermining of its sovereignty. For Europe can only exist in that act that is shared, compromised, and partitioned by the participation of something other than itself. Counter-sovereignty is thus built into the very sovereign identity of Europe. So autoimmunity is not the name of a malevolence or ailment. By making possible the exposure to the otherness of the other, by enabling the opening and exposure of the auto to otherness, it enables the return of the self to itself, thus interrupting the stability of an enduring self of the auto. In this respect, the Muslim citizen has to be regarded as Europe's chance to open itself to something beyond itself, to maintain a relation to something that is beyond the European self. Islam, now embodied in its Muslim citizen, is now Europe's chance for a self-destructive conservation of Europe, for a relation to something beyond the European self. This opening entails engaging with specters, and I'll be finishing in 2.5 minutes, I thought. Can I? 3, perhaps. This engagement, talking with and listening to the ghosts, is not for the purpose of revealing the secret hidden behind their encrypted presence. Derrida does not seek to return the ghost to the order of knowledge by solving its puzzle. Trying to avoid any such restoration, he advocates encountering what is strange, unheard, or other about the ghost. It is the arrival of the guest who puts the host into crisis, as it threatens to inhabit the immune system of the host with all its alienness and transform the host's capacity to sustain its auto-condition. The new Europe that needs to be envisaged and cultivated invites us to rethink the complicated issues of European memory, inheritance, and responsibility. To be responsible to the memory of the Enlightenment implies attending to the colonialist and nationalist bent of that history. The European experience cannot be embraced without a critical appraisal, as that experience also involves genocide, racism, colonialism, nationalism, and totalitarianism. A critical and responsible relation to the European past is indispensable for a new Europe to come. By developing a critical relation to the European past, Derrida encourages us to rethink what it means to inherit and what it means to be responsible to the memory of Europe. The critical relation to the European past involves a certain responsibility to the discourse that we inherit. However, inheritance is not about being simply faithful to tradition or developing a nostalgic relation to what we inherit. In that sense, to inherit does not entail a simple affirmation of what is entrusted to us. Inheritance also requires that we abide by the responsibility that comes with it, which includes changing what has been passed on to us. For this reason, the responsibility towards what we inherit involves a task and a responsibility to the tradition and its deconstruction go hand in hand. Hence, inheritance comes with a double command. It requires that we be loyal to and affirm what we inherit, but at the same time transform and deconstruct it by not letting the tradition close itself off and thereby allow that tradition to open itself to its heterogeneity, open it up to a relation with alterity. The double command that comes with responsibility attests to the operatic nature of inheritance, as I summarized. So this implies inventing new ways of imagining Europe and not letting one tradition overrule, overthrow, and surpass the other. Rather than recoiling from incompatible demands and injunctions, European responsibility involves opening up Europe to other traditions and demands. It is this radical openness and unconditional hospitality to non-European otherness, this negotiation with more than one tradition that characterizes European responsibility. The unconditional receptivity to non-European demands and injunctions goes hand in hand with being responsible to what inherits. For Europe to be able to offer another mondialization or alternative worldwideization, finished? Okay, it has to remain heterogeneous to itself. And okay, regarding the colonial past and this exterior, the colonial past is not simply to be found in the dusty archives, but is here and haunts us in the suburban spaces of postmodern European metropolises, in the multifarious forms of contemporary racism, in the collective fantasies and borders set between the comfort zones of middle-class domestic interiors and the shabby shanty towns of second and third generation post-colonial citizens. I have an extended analysis of the film Kaşe here, and I play with this inheritance and the post-colonial citizens, but I don't have time to get into that. Colonialism's always already present nature can be seen in the way painful and traumatic events are represented and remembered. The presence of post-colonial citizens should be seen as an opportunity not to repeat the dogmas of the previous constitution of European identity in sovereign terms, but to transform European tradition by exposing it to conflicting demands, injunctions, and traditions. This is a gesture that can yield Europe to heterogeneity and open it to a future. By opening European history to otherness and difference, we can contribute to the compromising a unified and sovereign sense of Europe based upon the phantasm of an omnipotent, self-sufficient, and self-identical Europe. The post-colonial citizen is the specter that haunts Europe. Rather than being a repressed or hidden secret whose knowledge has to be deciphered, the undaunted presence of the past by way of the ex-colonial immigrants indicates a productive ethical opening in the phantasm of purity of Europe and the deconstructive gesture toward an opening of European sovereignty to counter sovereignties. Thank you.